Imagine this. You're one of the most powerful rulers in human history. You've crushed every enemy that dared to challenge you. Your people literally worship you as a living god. And yet somehow, you end up murdered in your own bed by the very people you trusted most. That's exactly what happened to Ramesses III. And honestly, the story behind his death is so dark, so twisted, that it makes modern political scandals look like child's play. Because what we're about to dive into isn't just about a king getting taken down. It's about wives being punished for their husbands' crimes, entire bloodlines being erased, and a conspiracy so deep inside the palace walls that it would eventually bring down Egypt's last great pharaoh. And guys, this isn't some made-up legend. This is documented, word for word, in the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, the same ancient record that exposed one of history's most infamous palace conspiracies. So buckle up, because the story of Ramesses III is about to get absolutely wild. Let's set the scene. Ramesses III ruled Egypt during what should have been a golden age. But honestly, the empire he inherited was already falling apart. Decades of war, famine, and corruption had drained the kingdom dry. Sure, the great temples still sparkled with gold, and the pharaoh still wore his blue crown of war like he owned the world. But behind the scenes, ordinary Egyptians were literally starving. Soldiers were fighting over bread instead of honor. And Egypt's enemies were closing in from every direction. Libyan raiders were attacking from the west. The mysterious sea peoples were smashing into Egypt's coastlines like waves of pure destruction. And inside the palace, loyalty had become as fragile as papyrus. Ministers were whispering, servants were listening, and the royal women, oh, the royal women, they were watching every move, waiting for any sign of weakness. Now, here's where things get really dark. Ramesses knew he was surrounded by threats, so he did what any paranoid ruler would do. He built a massive spy network that reached into every corner of his kingdom. His word literally controlled every aspect of people's lives, even the private lives of his enemies. And when rival kingdoms dared to rebel against Egypt, Ramesses didn't just want military victory. No, he wanted total humiliation. He wanted their names forgotten, their bloodlines erased, their entire legacies burned to ash. And this is where it gets absolutely horrifying. The wives of these defeated enemies, women who had been queens, priestesses, noble women, they weren't spared. In Ramesses' twisted view of justice, guilt was inherited. Punishment became collective. These women were dragged to Thebes not as prisoners of war, but as living warnings of what happened when you challenged Egypt's so-called living god. Picture this scene. The sun is setting over the Nile, the waters turning blood red in the dusk light, and boats are drifting toward Thebes filled with women whose entire worlds had just been destroyed. Some of them had been queens. Others were priestesses of foreign gods or noble women from cities that literally didn't exist anymore. Now they're standing in silence with their wrists bound in linen cords, walking barefoot through the dust while crowds of soldiers and citizens line the streets to watch. To the crowd, this was entertainment. To Ramesses, it was theater. Every single step these women took proved that Egypt's divine ruler could humble even the proudest foreign queens. And inside the palace, preparations had already begun in the Hall of Judgment. But here's the thing. This wasn't some divine trial with scales weighing hearts and gods deciding fates. No, Ramesses had already decided what would happen to them. Scribes cataloged each captive, writing down their names, recording their origins, marking their families as enemies of Egypt. Their identities were preserved only so they could be erased later. The women were taken to something called the House of Women inside the royal complex. And guys, that phrase might sound harmless, but those who served in the palace knew exactly what it meant. Once a woman was taken there, she didn't come back. The House of Women stood deep inside the palace grounds. And while it was spoken of as this sanctuary for royal wives and concubines, behind those carved doors it was something completely different. For the captives of Ramesses III, it wasn't a house of beauty, it was a house of silence. The rooms were vast but empty, stripped of gold, filled only with the sound of footsteps and fear. Guards lined the corridors with masked faces, and their orders were crystal clear. No word leaves this place. Every window was sealed with lattice stonework, so that no light could fully enter. It was basically a cage of elegance designed to remind these prisoners that even in luxury, they were completely powerless. Inside, the women were divided by rank. Those with noble blood got chambers, while the rest were kept in shared halls, sleeping on woven mats. They were fed sparingly. Bread, dates, water from the Nile, and all their jewelry and silks were taken and replaced with plain linen robes marked with the pharaoh's insignia. This humiliation was done methodically, piece by piece, until nothing was left of their past lives except their reflections of Ramesses' victory. And here's what's so twisted. Some of these women actually whispered about ransoms or prayed for release after some time passed. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. This was the same pharaoh who had survived assassins in his own harem before. The same ruler who genuinely believed that rebellion began in the hearts of women, that wives could birth treachery as easily as they could birth life. To Ramesses, punishing the wives of his enemies wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. It was a lesson written into bloodlines, making absolutely sure that no child of rebellion would ever rise again. Days turned into weeks, and the captives were made to appear before priests who recited oaths of loyalty. They were told to renounce their old gods and bow before Egypt's divine order. Some obeyed, but others stood in silence with unyielding eyes and unmoving lips. And those who refused, they vanished. Nobody saw where they were taken, but every morning, guards were seen carrying out linen bundles wrapped way too tightly to be clothing. Then came what the priests called the purification of the foreign. This horrifying ritual that Ramesses ordered across Thebes. On the chosen day, beneath a burning sun, crowds gathered outside a temple courtyard where incense rose and drums pounded and trumpets sounded. The captives were led out barefoot, draped in pale linen, with marks of their old kingdoms still visible in tattoos and ornaments. They were made to stand before statues of gods while scribes read aloud the names of their fallen husbands, traitors, rebels, enemies of Egypt, and each name was followed by a curse or chant meant to erase their memory. Then Ramesses stepped forward in his blue crown of war, the crook and flail crossed on his chest, and he declared, "Let those who shared the hearts of my enemies share their fate. Let Egypt see that no bond, no womb, no woman will shelter rebellion." Then Ramesses stepped forward in his blue crown of war, the crook and flail crossed on his chest, and he declared, "Let those who shared the hearts of my enemies share their fate. Let Egypt see that no bond, no womb, no woman will shelter rebellion." What followed wasn't a swift execution. It was slow, deliberate humiliation, a ritual meant to crush the spirit before crushing the flesh. The captives were forced to kneel as offerings were made to the gods. Their names were struck from records, their family lines declared extinguished. Each one was branded with the symbol of a broken falcon, the mark of those who betrayed the divine order. When the ritual finally ended, They weren't led to freedom. They were taken to the edge of the desert, to the Pharaoh's labor camps, where wives of kings became slaves of stone, carrying limestone blocks for temples they would never enter, grinding grain for soldiers who mocked their prayers. But here's where karma really starts to come into play. While the priests recorded this ritual as this triumph of divine justice, in the quiet corners of the palace, servants began whispering that maybe, just maybe, the Pharaoh's vengeance had gone too far, that maybe even the gods themselves might turn their eyes from him. And they were right to be worried, because months after the screams of those punished wives faded into the desert winds, something way darker began to stir inside the palace walls. See, when fear reigns for too long, loyalty dies quietly. Offerings started spoiling overnight. Oil lamps flickered without any wind. Priests began dreaming of falcons falling from the sky, the same broken falcon that had been branded on those captives. And this is where we get to the conspiracy that would end everything. Inside the women's quarters, the air grew heavy with incense and dread. The wives of courtiers and soldiers who had watched what happened to those captives began to fear for their own lives. They had seen what happened when people disobeyed. They wondered, if the Pharaoh could do that to the wives of kings, what might he do to them? And right here, among the silks and secrets, the first whispers of conspiracy began. A woman named Ti, one of Ramesses' secondary wives, started gathering allies. She had seen the Pharaoh's cruelty up close, seen how he punished the innocent, and she knew his thirst for control had consumed his reason. She knew that if she did nothing, her own son would never see the throne. Ti's plan was simple and absolutely suicidal. She would strike at the heart of divine power itself. She began reaching out to people who had lost everything to the Pharaoh's wrath. Soldiers who'd been demoted, priests who'd been shamed, officials who'd been passed over for promotions. She offered them hope and vengeance. And in Egypt, plots never stayed secret for long. Dream interpreters started reporting visions of snakes in the royal bed. The chief scribe found strange messages burned into papyrus with names crossed out and replaced by others. Guards felt an unease they couldn't explain. But when the conspiracy finally reached Ramesses' ears, he laughed. He had built an empire on fear and believed that fear would protect him forever. What he didn't see was that his own court had stopped believing he was a god. They obeyed out of habit, not devotion. And once that belief died, even the most powerful man in the world was just a mortal waiting for his punishment. The night it happened, Thebes was quiet, too quiet. Inside his private chamber, Ramesses III prepared for rest, believing the danger had passed because he'd already ordered arrests and executions weeks earlier. He was convinced he'd crushed the conspiracy before it even began. He didn't know the real traitors were still inside the palace, waiting. Ti's allies had moved carefully, bribing guards, replacing servants, hiding messages inside offerings and perfumes. They knew every detail of the Pharaoh's nightly routine. And that night, as Ramesses reclined on his bed of carved cedar with linen sheets perfumed with lotus oil, he looked less like a god and more like a tired old man. The attack came swiftly. A blade flashed in the torchlight, bronze and curved and ceremonial, the same kind used in sacrifices. Ramesses tried to rise, but the hands that once built empires were no match for betrayal. The knife cut deep across his throat, silencing the voice that had once commanded nations. By morning, the Pharaoh was gone, his death hidden behind the language of ritual. The court announced that the great lord had joined the gods peacefully, but the truth couldn't stay buried. The Judicial Papyrus of Turin, uncovered centuries later, revealed every single detail: the names of Ty's allies, the trials that followed, the executions that erased an entire generation of courtiers. When Ramesses III's mummy was discovered in the 19th century, scientists found that deep wound across his throat, clean and deliberate and unmistakable, proof that the ancient records were true. The great pharaoh who had enslaved and punished the wives of his enemies had met his own end the exact same way: silent, betrayed, and completely powerless. And nearby, archaeologists found another body, a young man's corpse with his face contorted in terror, mouth open in a silent scream. Historians believe this was Pentaweret, Ty's son, the prince who conspired to take his father's throne, denied honor and denied eternity. Egyptians called him the Screaming Mummy, and for generations, the legend of that scream haunted Egyptology as a symbol of what happens when ambition and vengeance consume a royal bloodline. So here's the takeaway from this absolutely insane story. Ramesses III's reign, once seen as the final golden age of Egypt, ended not in triumph, but in betrayal. What began as a ruler punishing his enemies' wives ended with a king slain by his own family. A full circle of cruelty. A mirror reflecting Egypt's darkest truth. No power, no godhood, no wall of gold could protect a man from the consequences of his own tyranny. And today, this story is way more than ancient history. It's a reminder of how civilizations rise on power and fall to the very human flaws that power breeds: greed, jealousy, fear, and betrayal from the hands once sworn to serve. So the next time you see a statue of a pharaoh with that serene face carved in stone, remember, behind those calm eyes and that perfect smile once beat the heart of a man who believed himself untouchable, right up until the moment he wasn't.